Cailin, it's great to see you again.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so to the audience, we're very lucky to have Professor Cailin O'Connor. She is a leading thinker on misinformation, disinformation, how it spreads, and has a very unique take on it. We usually, when we talk about this, we look at aspects of individual psychology are exploited and lead to the spread of misinformation. But what Professor O'Connor and her colleagues have really studied is how the broader nature of social networks and information networks lead to the spread of information. And we're very excited to have her and help us think through this problem. So that was probably a very bad introduction. So Professor O'Connor, Cailin, would you like to introduce yourself and help our audience understand your work?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a professor at UC Irvine, and I'm a philosopher of science. So this is a kind of unusual niche area in academia that's interdisciplinary between philosophy and the different sciences. And in particular, the project that we're talking about on misinformation sits at that intersection because one sort of traditional area of interest for philosophy is knowing, epistemology. How do people know things? And one thing a lot of philosophers have thought about is how do the fact that we are humans who are social creatures who create knowledge in social groups impact our ways of knowing? So that comes from philosophy. And then I and my co-authors tend to use tools from the sciences to answer questions related to that. And in particular, one thing I do is draw on work from economics, from the other social sciences, even from biology, to create models of different systems of social interaction, and then try to use those models to understand questions like, why do certain ideas pass from person to person? How do the networks that we're all situated in shape the way we come to believe things? Questions like that.
Okay, no, thank you. So for today, I think we wanted to divide the conversation into three parts. So first, we'll talk about how you've studied information spreading through a network of honest, rational people. And how that's kind of this idealized state of a knowledge network, but what happens there and how misinformation can even spread in that ideal state. Then second, get into how you analyzed propagandists exploiting this network, which I thought was really interesting because most of us think of propaganda as big posters in a totalitarian state, but I think you and your colleagues have really identified specific tactics that our audience should really identify, define, and be aware of. And then finally, apply these insights to some of the disinformation challenges we face today. So does that sound good, those three parts?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe we could just start with, if you could just talk through in this idealized state of scientists who believe in evidence, logic, they're rational, how knowledge spreads, both good and bad.
Yeah, so I mean, first, maybe I should just clarify a little bit. What I'm going to be talking about comes from this project where I have a sort of primary co-author, Jim Weatherall, who's another philosopher of science in my department. And a lot of what I'll be drawing on in particular is part of a book that we wrote called The Misinformation Age, where we use these kinds of models to talk about the spread of false beliefs in human communities. So we sort of start off by thinking about normal spreading of false belief, or what we might think of as things that are endogenous to human networks, that are just part of being humans in a social group. So the first thing to talk about there is just that as humans, where we get most of our information is other people. So there's this kind of idea, especially coming from philosophy, that what's special about us is that we are rational agents, right? And so we have an ability to see evidence, uptake that evidence in a rational way, really think about it. And that is in part what humans do. But arguably a larger part of what we do is hear things from other people and then just believe them. So we get testimony from others. Someone says something like, I just walked down the street and there's someone selling ice cream over there. And we're like, great, there's ice cream at the end of the street. We don't take that evidence and sort of chug it through some machine of rationality. So part of what we're doing is just passing ideas from person to person. And once we realize that we're getting a huge chunk of our ideas in this relatively unreflective way, that means that we want to think about the networks of interaction when we're thinking about how to understand what humans come to believe. And so we want to ask, what are the situations where people are passing us information? What kinds of information are they providing? In what cases are we trusting them? In what cases are we not trusting them? So a good chunk of the sort of work we do, especially starting the book, is just thinking about these questions. What are the inherent properties of these networks of information sharing?
Yeah. Maybe now's a good time to just bring up the models that you use to help visualize this video interview. You just help us understand what these different graphics mean and how this will help guide the conversation.
Yeah, so what we've got here are some very simple examples of what are called networks. So these are mathematical constructs. They're used in all sorts of different areas of the sciences. But in particular, we use them as a way to think about social interactions and the spread of social belief. So if we look at one of these networks, say we take the cycle over here, we see a bunch of little dots or nodes, and each of those dots are supposed to represent an individual, so a person. And then we also see these lines connecting them. And those lines are supposed to represent something like a communicative tie, whereby you might share information or share an idea with someone. And we can look, so these are all kind of toy examples, but when we look across groups of humans, we see different structures in our networks, which means there are different ways in which we connect to the people around us. So sometimes we see something like the star over here, where you have central people who are very important to the network, who communicate with a lot of other people who are relatively unconnected to each other. So for example, that's what we sometimes might see with a very popular Twitter account and their followers. They're kind of at the center of the star, and then their followers are these edges. Or that's what we might see with a traditional media personality, someone who's communicating with many others, and they sort of have a large impact on the network. If we look over here at this clumpy group, this is something that we often see in sort of subsections of real human networks, where you see groups or cliques of people who are clustering together, where if I have a friend and they have a friend, I tend to be friends with their friend. So you see like these small cliques embedded in a larger structure, where the people in the cliques are going to be very impactful on each other. So, we use these kinds of structures in models, and then we might have something like, an individual here starts to test some new idea, explore something in the world, and then they might communicate it only to those people who they have links to. And then those people might be able to communicate to just the people they have links to, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, and I thought it was very powerful reading the book once I understood what these graphs or charts, what they meant. It in a very powerful, easy way, I suddenly kind of got the thrust of the book, how knowledge spreads from person to person, as you said, and testimony, and what makes us trust someone, like what that equation is crucial to understand and either prevent or pass on misinformation. Maybe do you want to maybe just talk through this term, the Bayesian updates and Bayes rule, and how that factors into your thinking?
Sure. So one way we use models to argue in the book is to point out that even when you have individuals who reason about evidence in very good ways, sometimes they can end up being misled by the fact that they're in a social group and the way social learning works. And so the reason it's nice to use models here is that all of us as individuals have all sorts of reasoning biases. These are widely recognized. But we can set up a model where we say, let's make the individuals really good at reasoning, put them in a social group, and ask, do they sometimes mess up? Do they sometimes come to false beliefs nonetheless? And in particular, the sort of standard we use to make these models of individuals who are really good at reasoning is called Bayesianism. So Bayesian updating refers to a way that you engage with evidence and change your beliefs about the world that is ideally rational. So it's basically the gold standard of how you should take evidence and turn it into your beliefs. And the sort of basic idea behind it is something like this. You have existing beliefs about the world. You can represent these as like probabilities. So maybe I think there's a 1% chance it will rain tomorrow. I live in Southern California, so probably I think even less, like a 1% chance.
I do too. Yeah, I know that.
Yeah. So I can represent my belief as that probability. And then if I get evidence or information about the world, say I get a weather report that says tomorrow there is a 90% chance of rain. Bayesian updating will mean I take that weather report and I sort of chug it through the rules of probability and then come out with a new probability for raining tomorrow. And in particular, because weather reports tend to be pretty accurate, my probability for rain should go up. So maybe it goes up from 0.1% to like 60%. Now I think there's a pretty good chance that it rains tomorrow. And so what we show is that under different conditions, groups of Bayesian updaters can still develop false beliefs. So here's the most basic example of how that can happen. You can have a group of people who are maybe testing two theories or possibilities in the world. Like maybe one is that cigarettes are dangerous and one is that cigarettes are safe. And maybe the evidence that they get is probabilistic. It's not always going to perfectly point in the right direction. That's how real scientific evidence works. Sometimes it points you the right way. Sometimes it happens to point you the wrong way. It tends in general to point in the right way, but you never know. You can have situations where you get maybe a misleading string of evidence. And then because you have a group of people who are all communicating, they communicate this evidence to each other. They all update in a rational way. They all come to the wrong conclusion. And then they fail to ever test the right conclusion. So maybe they all decide cigarettes are safe, and then they never again explore whether cigarettes are dangerous. So you can have that kind of failure. We also look at sort of other basic ways that failures can happen. So here's another one. We might suppose that in our models, every individual tends to trust others who share their beliefs. And we know that real humans tend to do this as well. So maybe if I tend to think cigarettes are dangerous and you tend to think cigarettes are dangerous, I trust the things you tell me about cigarettes more than I trust someone who says they're safe. If we add just that to the model and otherwise have them learn in this rational way, what we show is that you can end up with situations where you get polarized groups of people. All the people over here think cigarettes are dangerous. All the people over here think they're safe. They basically stop being able to communicate with each other because they don't trust each other's evidence anymore, even though they're otherwise rational learners. So that's another failure mode for otherwise really good reasoners. Mm-hmm. Or we show if you add a little conformity to the model, if like real people, the individuals in the model tend to want to do the same things as the people around them, again, you can have failures where people fail to explore good theories, where they fail to develop good beliefs because they're all trying to fit into the group, even though they otherwise are good at learning. So that's how we use Bayesian updating to think about the ways that groups of good reasoners can fail.
Mm-hmm. There are a couple amazing examples in the book that I wasn't familiar with. Could you maybe talk through there was an example, I think it was Semmelweis was a doctor who he kind of proposed washing hands before seeing patients, but was ostracized.
Yeah, so he was a doctor who worked in Vienna, obviously a long time ago, who was appointed to work in an obstetrical clinic in Vienna. There were basically two clinics side by side, one where they were training doctors and one where they were training midwives. And the death rate in the doctor clinic was extremely high. So something like 10% of the women who came in would die of what was called puerperal fever, childbed fever, whereas a much smaller number of the women in the midwives clinic would die. And in fact, women would be begging Semmelweis on their knees to be transferred from the doctor clinic to the midwife clinic because they were aware of this. So he takes over this clinic. He's very worried for obvious reasons about this death rate. At some point, he had a kind of, leap of intuition where he had a colleague who was performing an autopsy who, you know, cut himself and became sort of exposed to, what he was doing with the autopsy, and who developed symptoms that looked just like this childbed fever and then died. And Semmelweis realized, well, we have all these doctors who are performing autopsies on these women who have died and then going right to the birthing room and delivering babies. And he thought maybe something is transferred on their hands. And he called this cadaverous particles, because this was before there was a theory of germs and bacteria. So he started having the trainee doctors in his clinic wash their hands, and the death rate absolutely plummeted. It went down to a similar rate to the midwife's clinic. So he tried to convince all these other doctors, we got to do this thing. We've all got to start washing our hands to keep our patients alive. There's something that's being transferred on our hands that causes childbed fever. But what happened was that people were very skeptical of his claims. So other doctors did not adopt hand washing as a practice. This was a great frustration to Semmelweis. He implemented it in other clinics where, again, it worked, and yet he was unable to convince others to do it. So what we see here is a kind of enormous failure of science, or a failure of this social transfer of beliefs, because we have an extremely beneficial practice. We have excellent evidence that this practice works. You can compare the clinic before you hand wash and after you hand wash and see this huge drop in death. I mean, what is clearer than that, right? But a failure to adopt it. So we analyze this as an example of conformity and the ways conformity can prevent the spread of good beliefs. So I was mentioning, you have your model, you kind of add conformity to it, and you can see these failures because people want to fit in with each other. We think that in this case, that was part of what was going on. You have all these doctors who are engaged in a particular practice, and this isn't hand washing. And then this kind of outsider who's saying, do this thing. And they don't want to sort of stick out or go against standard practice to adopt what sounds to them like an implausibly beneficial practice, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what we use as a sort of example of people who otherwise should be pretty good at reasoning, doctors, but who are nonetheless failing to adopt good beliefs.
Yeah, and it's an amazing story about conformity. There's also a whole class element that you mentioned, because these doctors were like aristocrats, and there's, it's like the dumb dark joke, but it's like the allegory of the cave. I was like the allegory of the cadaver here. It's like just poor Semmelweis is like has all the evidence and no one believes him, or they believe him, but because of conformity, they just choose not to act on it. So these are some amazing examples of otherwise rational people arriving at false beliefs, just through the nature of testimony and who you choose to trust, and then bringing in conformity. Maybe one more example you brought up in the book was information cascades. Could you talk to that and how that can lead to false belief?
Yeah, so this comes from work elsewhere in the social sciences. It relates to another mechanism where you can have a group of individuals who are good reasoners, but then you can have the entire group end up taking, or most of the group end up taking, poor actions as a result of that reasoning. So the way an information cascade works is something like this. You have a group and everyone has some private information. So the kind of classic example is maybe it's about a stock, maybe it's Tesla stock. Everyone has some private information about just how good this is and whether they ought to buy or sell. Now, there's going to be some variability in that information. We assume not everyone gets an accurate signal, but across the group in general, the signal is accurate. If the stock is good, they ought to buy. If the stock is bad, they ought to sell. So you can have that information there in the group, but you can see the entire group fail in the following sort of way. So imagine that, in fact, it's good and everyone ought to buy it. If they were smart, that would be good for them. But that a couple prominent people start by selling their stock on the basis of their private information. So they have misleading private information. and two of them sell it. Now, that might be enough that the third person, even if they have private information saying, I ought to buy, would sell because they see what others have done. And they get information from that, right? They see this person sold, that person sold. They can assume that those people had information that that would be the right thing to do. And on the basis of that and their, uncertainty about the reality, they might sell themselves. And then you have a situation where you have, everybody selling and sort of seeing each other sell. And so you can have a cascade of information where the result is sort of mistaken beliefs and bad outcomes because of the social learning process, despite the fact that everyone's actually making, a sort of a reasonable inference that their stock is bad because a few people started by selling it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it kind of relates to sometimes you see in the like you'll see there's a pile-on effect in the media where maybe there's a headline and then maybe 20 different news organizations will repeat the headline, and it feels like you have 20 independent voices corroborating the same fact, but it's actually more of this type of information cascade.
Yeah, and there's a few things that work like that where if you're seeing it, it looks to you like you're getting information from many independent sources, but in fact, it's all information from one source. And so if just that one source is misled, the whole thing can be wrong. So this is a little different from an information cascade. But as you said, you see this in media all the time where you get one original source that was mistaken, and then everyone repeats that. And you often see individual journalists who trust other journalists and then just repeat what they've said without going to do their own research on a topic. And then you can get, the sort of widespread misinformation going through even pretty good traditional media sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Just to give a hilarious example that I've talked about, a few years ago, there were all these headlines that said something like, science finds that one glass of red wine a day is as good as an hour of exercise. And they all made that same claim, the 1 hour, one glass trade-off. Now, this was on the basis of a study of, can't remember, I think it was rats that were fed resveratrol, which is a compound, which there's a little bit of it in red wine, but not very much, and then ran on treadmills. And the ones that got the resveratrol did better on the treadmill. There was basically nothing in the study about wine. There was nothing about people. There was nothing about how much it traded off with exercise. But one journalist made this claim, and then a bunch of them did. And then when you see it across a bunch of sources, you think, well, that's definitely got to be true.
Yeah. That's an amazing story. So maybe then, maybe shifting from these examples where rational, evidence-driven scientists, even they are getting it wrong, maybe now we shift to the second part of your book where you and your colleagues introduce the propagandist. And maybe I just want to say, I think when I talk to a lot of users of our product, propagandist to I think the average person in America and the world, I mean, it feels like a kind of a magician who puts up like posters that say like, really outlandish, crazy things, but not necessarily someone who's very strategic, who has very well-defined tactics. And I think our ability to counter propaganda, the first thing I thought when I was just reading your book is, wow, this is like seeing the manual of the dark side, and we need to understand it if we're going to have any chance of countering what otherwise feels like, this mystical magician in the background. So maybe with that, do you want to maybe talk through the propagandist and to introduce this section? Do you just want to kind of talk through this for a second?
Sure. I mean, so yeah, so right. So we've been talking about the ways that groups can fail to develop good beliefs, basically as a result of endogenous features to human communities. Arguably, a much bigger threat are all of these people in our world who are trying to mislead us, various members of industry, various politicians, members of foreign governments. There are a lot of people who have something at stake in getting you to believe things and sometimes getting you to believe false things. So part of what we did was looked at different models where we introduced new agents who we called the propagandists, who are meant to be stand-ins of someone like the Internet Research Agency in Russia, or the tobacco industry in the US, or maybe some political group, and looked at the kind of historical ways that these groups have tried to influence, especially scientific beliefs in the public, and different ways that they've succeeded and not succeeded. So this is one diagram of one kind of model of this sort of thing, where we're imagining there are members of the public or policymakers who are trying to develop accurate scientific information. They are getting information from real scientists. So there's a scientific community where they do get information from them, but they might also be getting information from a propagandist who has some kind of goal, who maybe wants them to believe the wrong thing. And so they have conflicting social sources of information, and depending on the conditions and what's happening, they might be misled by what the propagandist is sharing with them.
And then these were some of the tactics you define in the book. And I think, I highly recommend anyone who's watching this to read the book. But I was hoping you could maybe just at a high level go through these tactics, just kind of define them, and some of the interesting learnings from modeling these techniques.
Yeah, sure. So a lot of what we drew on here came from historical work, for example, from the book Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. And we're not really historians, so we depended a lot on these other researchers, which, I mean, this stuff is really amazing. But I can talk through some of how these techniques work. So obviously the one we all think of when we think about how does an industry, for example, influence science, is through direct funding, right? They find a scientist, they give them some money, and they say, I'd like a study showing that tobacco is safe. And then that scientist produces that study and they can publish it. And that's very misleading. So sometimes that happens. And in fact, it happens pretty often. But what we focus on more are other techniques that are harder to identify and fit in less with our kind of pre-theoretic view of industry influence or propagandistic influence on scientific beliefs. So selective sharing falls under this second category, stuff that would be less intuitive. So when you look at evidence in science, but also in other places, it's probabilistic, as I mentioned before. So if we're talking about tobacco, not everyone who smokes gets cancer. And that means that when you do studies on something like smoking, but really on almost anything, sometimes those studies will point in the wrong direction. So sometimes you'll look at tobacco and its influence on lung cancer in mice, and you'll find no effect. You'll find that tobacco is safe in that particular study. Now, of course, across a body of evidence, you're not going to find that. You're going to find things pointing in the right direction because usually your evidence points you the right way. But one thing you see propagandists doing is taking these kind of contradictory or spurious findings and sharing them very widely. And that's very impactful because they're real scientific findings that they're sharing. They're not making stuff up. They're not committing fraud. They're taking real evidence from science, produced in a trustworthy way by independent scientists, and just using that to mislead the public. So it can be very effective when they can do that. Industrial selection is another technique that, makes use of the norms of science. It doesn't subvert science, but nonetheless allows outside actors to influence the progress of science. So this was first described by two philosophers of science, Bennett Holman and Justin Brunner. And what it involves is industry just picking who they're going to fund in ways that benefit them. So they might say, out of all these researchers out there in the community, which ones already think the things that we want to promote? So for example, if I'm Big Sugar, I might ask, which of these people think that fat causes heart disease and are studying the effects of fat on heart disease? And then I just fund those ones. I just fund those people looking into fat and heart disease, and they can produce more studies and they can hold conferences and they can train more graduate students, and then they publish more because they have this finding. And so then you get a bunch of papers looking at the connection between fat and heart disease rather than sugar and heart disease. And that can sway the way an entire branch of science goes and really sway what people come to think. And again, you haven't corrupted anyone. You're not lying in any way. You're just picking who gets money.
And you've changed the body of evidence. Like instead of going 70-30 one way, it might go 60-40, the way you want, because just the studies you want are just getting more money. Right.
Exactly. And there's just more of those studies.
And you pointed out another thing that's really interesting. And I have no academics in my family, so I was like talking to them about this, how this actually can affect almost the lineage of science, because scientists, they get old, they retire, they have grad students that turn into professors, and this type of, by skewing who's funded, you also skew the next generation.
Yeah, and this is part of what Holman and Bruner argue. If you give a bunch of money to these people looking in fat at heart disease, their students are going to be more likely to be looking at similar problems rather than testing some other alternative. Does sugar cause heart disease? Mm-hmm. Exactly right. So you kind of, through the fact that scientists are social creatures and are learning from each other, you can end up having an outsized influence on other members of the scientific community.
Mm-hmm. Could you maybe talk for a second? I thought it was really interesting. There was an example you had about heart arrhythmia and industrial selection. Could you talk to that a little bit? And
Yeah, and again, this draws from Holman and Bruner's work on this, where they looked into the history of this particular episode I think it started in the 70s, I believe, where researchers knew that arrhythmias tended to precede heart attacks. And so this question arose: if we suppressed heart arrhythmias, could that maybe prevent heart attack deaths? But there were different ways that researchers were looking into that question. So some people were looking at antiarrhythmic drugs and asking, do these prevent arrhythmia? Other people were looking at these drugs and asking, do these prevent death? And pharmaceuticals were funding the former group for good reason, because that's a much shorter time scale. And then they don't have to worry about whether the drugs actually prevent death. If they prevent arrhythmia, then maybe they can start to manufacture these drugs on the basis of that.
And they already knew it would prevent arrhythmia.
And they had good reason to think so. So they funded those researchers. They found that the drugs did prevent arrhythmia. And on the basis of that, pharmaceuticals were able to manufacture and sell these drugs. Now, the issue was that the drugs actually caused heart attack deaths, and it took quite a while to figure this out. And it's been estimated that tens of thousands of people were actually killed by antiarrhythmic drugs in this period. Yeah. So that's this perfect example of industrial selection.
Mm-hmm. And then I believe one of the scientists who initially was focused on arrhythmia changed his focus to death, but then lost his funding.
Yes, exactly right. So you see examples like that.
Yeah.
You also see cases where the people focused on arrhythmia were able, through industry funding, to hold these large conferences where they'd bring in a lot of researchers and share what they had found. And maybe more of those researchers would then get interested in these antiarrhythmic drugs. So you saw all these kind of ways that social connections could spread mm-hmm. ideas that are ultimately kind of coming out of industry.
Mm-hmm. And then maybe we talk the fourth and fifth techniques start to get into shaping public opinion more directly, whereas the first three are altering science itself, which indirectly then changes what the public thinks. Could we talk through these a little bit? These, by the way, these are very familiar in the world of marketing and public relations, whereas the first three I think are happening more behind the scenes.
Yeah, so this idea of creating doubt, again, comes from this Merchants of Doubt book, where they point out that this was one of the main things that various members of industry were doing when it came to these big public health issues, where the science was showing something's really dangerous for public health, but industry still wants to sell their product. So this happened with tobacco, with acid rain, with CFCs in the ozone hole, and then perhaps most notably with global climate change. So part of the idea here was that people realized they couldn't really use science to convince people that tobacco smoking is healthy, or that releasing carbon from fossil fuels is going to improve the environment. But instead, what they could do was continue to create doubt about the idea that these products were dangerous or harmful. So they could keep saying things like, but we found a scientist who says there isn't a consensus yet. It's too early to act. Maybe it's not tobacco, maybe it's asbestos, like it's causing lung disease. Maybe we have a natural warming blip that's going to turn around. So they used these sort of techniques to stop action, even when there was all this information that, in fact, tobacco smoking is dangerous and fossil fuels are warming the climate in a dangerous way.
There's a quote from the book I just have to read because I just think it's so powerful that you write that with the tobacco industry, the goal was to create the appearance of uncertainty, to find, fund, and promote research that muddied the waters, made the existing evidence seem less definitive, and gave policymakers and tobacco users just enough cover to ignore the scientific consensus. And then you quoted a tobacco company executive who later wrote, doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact. And this is so, it's just so true in just kind of general marketing that you'll often hear salespeople very proudly say, I don't have to prove my product is better than the other product. I just have to create FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt about which product is better. And then everything becomes 50-50. And that's how we kind of end up with a very mediocre, set of options in everything, politics, buying cars, whatever we're trying to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so it obviously very, very dismal reality there. Could you talk through just the use of expertise and authority?
Yeah, so you see this again with public beliefs about science and impact on those, because it does tend to be the case that members of the public trust scientific expertise and scientific authorities. And so one way you can mislead people is by creating false expertise or an illusion of expertise. So you saw this a lot with climate change, where members of industry who are trying to impact public belief would get these real scientists, usually physicists, for some reason it's always physicists, and they would have them sort of make statements against climate change, like there is no climate change, this is ridiculous, or all of these climate change researchers are just politically motivated. And so they would use their scientific expertise to create false doubt about global climate change. But of course, these people weren't real experts. They weren't climatologists or meteorologists. They were just people who looked like experts because they were real physicists, like real scientists of another stripe. And you see that sort of technique being used pretty often.
So I worked in clean energy for about 10 years. And the example that really struck me was the NIPCC that the oil industry created to counter the IPCC.
Yeah.
It's just outrageous, but.
Yeah, so you have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they produce regularly this report about all the science of climate change research. And then the Non-Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is just a propaganda body, producing a fake report that literally looks exactly the same. I mean, it's formatted the same way. It's just meant to confuse people.
We've talked about a lot of what can go wrong, even when the network is well-intentioned, rational, evidence-based people. Even that can lead to false belief, like with the hand washing or the vegetable lambs that the book starts with. And then we've talked about, now you introduce propagandists that are intentionally trying to spread misinformation and these very specific techniques that they've developed to alter the body of evidence or directly confuse the public. Maybe now we can move to something a little more positive, which are some of the solutions you suggest. So could you talk through, I kind of bucked it in three categories: the public suggestions for publication norms in science, for journalists, and then for the public at large. So could you maybe speak through those a little bit?
Yeah, so when it comes to publication norms in science, we're mostly focusing on those situations where you have people who are trying to mislead the public in science, like climate change, like vaping, maybe. uh, so in these kinds of scenarios, as discussed, spurious pieces of information can be really damaging. They can be used by industry to confuse other people. Consensus tends to be powerful. If all the experts agree, that tends to be kind of a powerful impact on public belief. So some things we propose are things like, we don't want to have a lot of small studies that can go wrong out there in these sort of cases. Instead, we want big studies that are pushing in the right direction and that can't be weaponized by industry. So we propose things like, instead of doing many small studies on tobacco, let's have a bunch of labs all study the dangers of tobacco and then combine their information into one like meta-analysis before publishing it. So create a consensus before publication happens to take away these tools that industry can use. So that's one thing that we propose in that area.
It's so fascinating how it's simply that there's this subtle propagandist technique of promoting lots of small studies, some of which are going to go in their direction, and then giving them just enough talking points to create the doubt. And so a very simple counter is to have large sample sizes and teach the public to look for that.
Of course, we should always want good standards for sample sizes and quality in science. Let's just always have that.
Right. Could you talk about, you're kind of suggesting a higher bar for replication. I thought that was fascinating. There was a quote you had where actually, I think it was from a Nature study, that 70% of scientists across disciplines had failed to reproduce results of a colleague, and half of them couldn't reproduce their own results.
Yeah, so I mean, this is something that is known as the replication crisis in science that has hit a number of disciplines that have realized we have all these published findings that it looks like they might be false, or at very least we can't replicate them, where that's supposed to be the standard of science, that if you do X, you get Y, and then if you do X again, you get Y again. And so there's a connection between X and Y. There are a lot of reasons why the replication crisis has occurred. There are a lot of proposals for fixing it, but some of the things that people argue for is just having high standards in scientific communities where you expect that people do a lot of things to ensure that their studies really are finding what they say they're finding.
And there's just there's kind of a general shift that has to happen from you were proposing, we give too much weight to what's novel and not enough weight to replicating. Like maybe you won't get published, maybe you won't get tenure if you replicate, and you will if you produce something novel and different. And that whole equation maybe needs to be.
I see what you were saying about weight of replication. Yes. So in general, credit is assigned to scientists who have new and exciting findings. That's how you get attention. You don't tend to get a lot of credit for showing that something that we already thought was true is in fact true. But one thing people argue for is that scientific journals and the institutions scientists are part of should try to give more credit for people to ensure that the things that we think are scientific knowledge really are, to get more people to do that replication work.
I mean, that's a good segue to how journalists, how they should think about evidence and properly weighting it. Do you want to talk through some of the recommendations for media?
Yeah, again here, because we're philosophers of science, a lot of our recommendations have to do with science reporting and the way people, report on new evidence. But there are some sort of pitfalls that you see journalists sometimes engaging in. So one example is reporting widely on individual studies. And in the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw this happen again and again and again, where one team would find something, they'd publish it. Maybe it wouldn't even be published yet. It would be in a preprint archive where it hasn't been reviewed by peers yet. Journalists would pick it up and report on just that finding and treat that as scientific truth. And then it gets spread all over the internet. Now, the problem with that is that any one scientific study can be wrong. That's what this thing about probabilistic evidence means. You can be wrong when you publish just one study. You want to build your beliefs on the basis of as many studies as you can. You want to get all of the evidence together and then figure out what you think is true. So again and again during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw these things getting out there, and then it turns out they're wrong. Oops, try to pull it back. But that doesn't really work. Once the information is out there, you can't just reverse it or make people know it's not right. So instead, what journalists should always be doing is drawing on all the available evidence when they report on some topic. So don't just look at this one study on the death rate of COVID. Look at that study and the 5 others that have been done. Talk about all of them and what all of them together might tell you. And that's the best way to produce science articles that are going to be the least misleading.
Mm-hmm. And in something like COVID, where you had the knowledge was being created in real time, I think there's maybe a responsibility to explain that, like hydroxychloroquine, there were initial studies that suggested maybe it's working in France and China, and then it was the larger samples later that showed, kind of like with heart arrhythmia, that not only was it not working, it was so bad that they actually had to stop the large trials. But by then, kind of the cat was out of the bag. It became politicized. One group said hydroxychloroquine is great. One said it's not great. And you kind of lost the actual need to, like, science can't happen instantly. And I think, like, it's one thing to kind of, when the studies are all there for the journalists to assemble them, which is very important, and they don't do. And then it's like when the studies aren't even there, there's even more responsibility, right, to kind of communicate the uncertainty. So maybe then, maybe jumping a little bit just to the public at large, what would you say, what are recommendations for the average citizen who's not a journalist, they're not a scientist? How can we contribute and kind of think more responsibly as members of these networks that are being influenced by others?
So a lot of work on misinformation and communication about misinformation really focuses on this question: what can you do as an individual?
Mm-hmm.
In response to that, I want to give a sort of non-standard response. I don't want everyone to be focused so much on, like, how do I become good at dealing with information? It's good to do that, but instead to think about, how do I put pressure on the people who have a lot of power to shape our information environments? It's tremendously inefficient for every single one of us to have to figure out how to get really good at identifying and avoiding misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
It's much easier for platforms and governments to shape social media environments, traditional media environments, so that most of us are getting accurate or good information most of the time. So we really, I think, need to be focused on these sort of social level solutions. How do we change things so that it's easy for us as users to develop good beliefs, rather than expecting every person in the world to have to develop these really hard competencies that we're not really necessarily evolved for in some ways. So yeah, think about, like, who you can elect, how you can put pressure on Facebook. That's what I encourage people to do.
Okay. So a few questions just as I was reading that I want to bring up. So one is, someone could read this and, there's a lot of examples of propagandists distorting the scientific process, which indirectly or directly distorts public opinion. So someone might read this, and I can think of a lot of more like libertarian type people I know who would read this and just say, you know what, I doubt all information. All sources are intentionally or unintentionally corrupt. And they have this perception that they are this incredible independent thinker, when in fact they just doubt everything and are kind of empowering the merchants of doubt, because when you doubt everything, you end up just following your biases. But how would you respond to someone who's reading some of your work and saying, well, my takeaway is I should just doubt everything?
I mean, if you want to be someone who knows true things about the world, what you want to do are be believing the true things that come to you and disbelieving the false things. So obviously you don't want to believe everything you hear. Obviously you don't want to ignore everything you hear, because sometimes you get good information and sometimes you get bad information. So, the sort of simplest heuristics for doing that tend to focus on the sources of information, because there tend to be sources that are mostly dependable and then sources that are mostly not dependable. So if you trust a source like the New York Times, well, they're wrong sometimes. I don't always agree with them, but they're mostly dependable because they have a reputation to protect, they have fact checkers. Their very existence depends on them producing mostly trustworthy journalism most of the time. And so it's a good heuristic to trust them. That's going to help you have good beliefs about the world. On the other hand, there are other media sources that their existence does not depend on having fact checkers and producing accurate information. It depends on producing exciting or polarizing or dramatic information. And if you trust those sources, you're going to usually or often be misled, right? So if what you want to do is to believe true things, then you do need to be disambiguating between these good and bad sources of information rather than just being skeptical about everything.
Mm-hmm. And then maybe you could speak a little to, I mean, there's a lot of examples in your book where it is elite authorities who are corrupting information. And it's not all elite authorities, it's just there's some embedded bad actors in science, in government, in media. We've seen examples in religion. But one thing that's happened is there's been a general public rejection of elite authorities on both sides of the political aisle. And you see populist leaders emerge, and a lot of their authority comes from rejecting elites. But then these populist leaders themselves are using a lot of propagandist techniques. So like in this weird way, it's like the grassroots and the top down are both fundamentally being manipulated the same way. I don't know, how do you think about today's populism and the rejection of elites that are corrupting information?
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of populist leaders cynically encourage people to reject information from certain elites in order to control public mind, right? As a member of the public, it can be very hard to tell the difference between trustworthy and not trustworthy elites, sources of information. I think a general good rule is to look at incentive structures and what kind of people you're talking about. Where are they in a social network and how are they incentivized vis-a-vis that position? So if you're looking at scientists, they have tremendous incentives not to be wrong about things and not to lie, because if they do, they lose their jobs. They get credit, they get money, they get hired by producing good, trustworthy information and interesting information. But like at the heart of it is that you want to be producing epistemically trustworthy information as a scientist. So that's where their incentives are. That means that most scientists are, like the New York Times, are pretty trustworthy most of the time. Politicians don't necessarily have the same incentives to tell the truth about things and produce epistemically good information. And so in general, they're going to be a worse source of information about scientific fact than scientists are. And so you can be sensitive to those differences between sources and use that to disambiguate them.
Mm-hmm. No, thanks so much. So we've taken a lot of your time and we've learned a lot from you. I want to kind of end just by telling people who've heard to encourage them to read your book. And also that I think laying out the history, the theory, and the techniques of misinformation spreading through networks is a very important foundation to then do more media literacy type things that a lot of people are advocating. I think when you just study media literacy without that foundation, you don't really have the why, and you don't know the how of what you're fighting. And I think you've laid out in very clear language, it's accessible for non-experts like me to read and understand what we're up against. So thank you very much for your work and for spending time with us.
Well, thank you for everything you're doing and for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.